My name is Jessica Wright, student number 201-30412. Today I'm going to demonstrate three behaviours with Alfie. I'm going to demonstrate sit, down and loose lead walking. I'm going to use a variety of techniques to demonstrate these. First of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about using reinforcers. A reinforcer is something that the dog really wants or really needs, and we use it to motivate the dog to work for us. Food is a primary reinforcer. It needs to be something really high value to the dog, easy to eat and as small as you can get away with. For example, I'm using small pieces of cheese, which you can see Alfie's quite interested in. You could also use small pieces of hot dog. You could use a variety of different treats in your training pouch. This keeps the dog guessing. He never knows what sort of treat he's going to get next from you, and he will offer the behaviours more readily. By using a small treat, you can get in a really high rate of reinforcement, which is really important when you're training in this way. Toys are classed as a secondary reinforcer. You could use things such as a raggy toy. Unfortunately, Alfie gets quite fixated by these, so I won't be using those to train him today. The first technique I'd like to demonstrate is lure and reward. This is a positive reinforcing technique. As Alfie's in a sit, we shall lure, oh, it's just gone into a down. From a down, we shall lure him back up into a sit. So to do this, you need to hold a piece of tasty treat, the cheese, in front of his nose. Very slowly bring it back above his head. You should follow it, and as he comes up and is into position, you reinforce with the cheese. So to lure and reward back into the down, again hold your cheese in front of the dog's nose, bring it slowly down in front of him, down between his paws, and he goes back into a down, and you can reinforce with the cheese. The main aim of lure and reward is to eventually fade the lure to a hand signal. You can do this by using a closed hand. Again, you hold it above the dog's nose, move it up, and he would hopefully follow it back up into a sit. And you can then do exactly the same, move your hand back down and lure the dog back into a down position. Once you have an 80% success rate of the dog performing the behaviour, that's the point at which you'd add the verbal cue. For example, sit, which he's not going to do for me today because he's not really awake this morning. And then we will talk about the lure and reward technique for loose lead walking. So the first thing you need to do with loose lead walking is to set your criteria. You need to decide whereabouts you want the dog to walk. So I prefer to have Alfie on the left hand side of me. I don't mind if he's a couple of steps in front of me or a couple of steps behind. Alfie, come on up. Good boy, here. Now, come. So take a tasty piece of cheese, hold it in front of the dog's nose and just walk forward, and as long as the dog's in the correct position you can keep reinforcing with the tasty pieces of cheese. And as long as your lead's in a nice, happy, smiley face, I'm happy with that. With all these behaviours, you need to generalise them. So you start in an area with low distractions, such as your living room. You can then move on to your garden, where there are a few more noises and distractions for the dog. You can then eventually take your dog and train him in the park or on your daily walks. It's really important when you're training a new behaviour to use a continuous schedule of reinforcements, which basically means every time the dog performs a behaviour, you reinforce with a tasty treat. You then want to put the reinforcement schedule onto a variable schedule. This will strengthen the behaviour and make it more reliable, as the dog is never quite sure when he's going to be reinforced, so he will offer the behaviour more readily. I'm now going to talk about lure and click. Again, this is a positive reinforcement technique, very similar to lure and reward, but in this case you have a clicker. So every time the dog hears a click, you reinforce. The clicker acts as a bridging stimulus, but it also precisely marks when the dog is performing the behaviour. Whenever you start a clicking session, it's a really good idea to load the clicker, so the dog doesn't actually have to do anything, but you just click and reinforce. This reminds the dog that whenever he hears a clicker, he gets a tasty treat. As you can see, it took me quite a long time to get the tasty treat then, so he knew that he'd done something good with hearing the clicker first. So we shall just demonstrate the down from the sit. So same principle, hold the cheese in front of the dog's nose, lower it to the ground. As soon as he gets to the floor, click and reinforce. And then we can do back up into a sit, hold the cheese in front of the dog's nose, move it back above his head. As soon as it's in position, click and reinforce. As with lure and reward, you're wanting to fade the lure. You can fade it again to a hand signal, and again at 80% of success of the dog performing the behaviour, that's when you would be wanting to add the cue. You could also do exactly the same for the loose lead walking. The dog's following the treat and as he's in position, click and reward. I'm now just going to talk about modelling. It's not something that I would recommend using on your dog, particularly on an unknown dog, because some dogs would view it as positive punishment because you're adding something that they don't necessarily like, because you can use a certain amount of force which causes the dog discomfort. So, Alfie, come. Alfie, come. Too many distractions out the window. You're like a good boy. So if you were to model a sit, you would put your hand on the dog's bottom, your hand under his head, and physically push him down into the sit. From a sit into a down, you would pull the legs forward, possibly putting your hand on the dog's shoulders, and force him into a down. As I said, it's not a recommended technique because it can cause some distress to the dog. The next technique I'm going to talk about is targeting. With targeting, you are pairing a secondary reinforcer with a primary reinforcer, the food. The secondary reinforcer would be your hand, a specially designed target stick, or you could use a wooden spoon, and you're getting the dog to touch or to follow the stick or your spoon or your hand. You could also use targeting for sending the dog to a certain point, so you could use a piece of paper, a piece of carpet, and that acts as a mark, and you're targeting the dog to go away from you to go to that point. So I'm going to demonstrate loose lead walking with the targeting, because Alfie will target my hand. Alfie, yeah. Good boy. Alfie, touch. Good. So he knows to touch my hand, so I'm just going to reinforce that. Take a couple of steps forward with my hand in place, and he will just follow them. You can reinforce initially on a continuous schedule, then reduce that down to a variable schedule, and eventually the dog will just follow your hand wherever you want him to go, which Alfie does really well. He really enjoys that. To use targeting with a sit on a down, you can use a mat like we have here, the sheepskin, and ask Alfie for a sit. And you can then increase the distance at which you are from the mat and still ask the dog for the same behaviour. You can also ask him for a down, doing this exact same technique. Capturing is the next technique I'd like to talk about. It's again positive reinforcement. It's where the dog will spontaneously offer the behaviour that you're desiring. It relies heavily on the trainer observing very closely as to what the dog is doing. You then need to mark the desired behaviour, preferably with a clicker, and then reinforce. So every time the dog offers the behaviour, Alfie's just lied down, so I can click that and reinforce. And you repeat that every time the behaviour is offered by the dog. So as the dog is emitting the behaviour and he's doing it quite reliably at 80%, then you would add the cue and reinforce. You eventually get to the point that you add the cue, you give the cue to the dog, then the behaviour is emitted, then you have the reinforcement going on. Again, this is something that you can put under a continuous schedule of reinforcement and then move it onto a variable schedule of reinforcement. So, as I said, whenever the dog lies down or sits down, that's when you can give them a tasty treat and reinforce them for their behaviour. You can also do it with loose lead walking, just whenever you're out on a walk and the dog happens to be in the correct position. If you've got plenty of treats in your pocket, just keep rewarding and they will stay in position for you until it becomes second nature to them. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about shaping. Shaping is a process of altering the dog's behaviour by successive approximations towards the final behaviour that you desire. Again, it relies very much on the trainer observing what the dog's doing. You need to, from a sit into a down, you would be looking for the dog moving his head in small increments and clicking and rewarding, and you very, very gradually increase the criteria until the dog is in a down position. And you can also do from a stand to a sit, if the dog his back end is lowering down, just like inch by inch, and you just click and reinforce each moment that he's going back down to the floor, and eventually you will get the dog into a sit. As the dog is offering the behaviour himself and you're not asking for it, this is a really good, strong method of training, and it's much less susceptible to extinction. So, for example, Alfie's in a down at the moment. I'd prefer him to be in more of a sphinx-like position, because at the moment he's just sort of over to one side. So you could very gradually, as he click and reinforce tiny little movements and to get him into the correct position that you want. Stimulating is another method of training that you can use. You can tend to use it in conjunction with some of the other methods like lure and click and lure and reward. It basically means that you're using the environment to help you get the behaviour from the dog. So you can see Alfie's lying on his nice comfy sheepskin. You can use that for a sit or a down. You could also use a chair to stimulate a down. So for example, you could pop the chair in front of your dog if he's standing or sitting, pop a tasty treat or a toy under the chair, and as the dog lowers his head, you're persuading him into a down. And then you could, with shaping, you could shape that into a full down by using the clicker to mark the increasing behaviour towards the floor. If you're wanting to stimulate loose lead walking, you could use the hallway in your house. It's a nice straight passageway and the dog has less distractions and will focus more on the trainer. You can then build that up to going outside, where you could use a wall or a fence. Again, this offers less distractions to the dog and keeps them close to you. I'm just going to talk a little bit about pre-MAC principle, which is where you ask for a low probability behaviour in return for a high probability behaviour. For example, you ask the dog for a sit before you let him off lead for a good run round in the garden or in a field. Or you could ask him for a sit before you open the door and let him out. I use pre-MAC quite a lot for a down with Alfie. So I ask for a down before he has his tennis ball thrown. I also ask for a down before he meets a new dog, and then he gets to go and have a play. For loose lead walking, you can use pre-MAC principle. For example, you can walk your dog to the park on a nice loose lead, and then when he gets there, he gets some off-lead running time. 300 peck is another method of training. Basically, you need to slowly and incrementally increase the distance and duration of the behaviour that you're performing. So for example, with loose lead walking, you take 1 step with the dog in the correct position, click and reinforce, 2 steps, click and reinforce, 3 steps, click and reinforce, and so on. If at any point the dog moves out of position, that's classed as a fail, so you wouldn't reinforce and you'd go back to step 1. The theory behind 300 peck is that by 300 steps the behaviour is said to be acquired. This can get a little bit boring for both the dog and the trainer, but it's incredibly methodical and works really well. You can also use 300 peck to increase distance and duration with the sit and the down. For example, you have the dog in a sit, count 1, click and reinforce, count 2, click and reinforce. So you're lengthening the duration of the sit, and you would do exactly the same for the down. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about legal and moral implications of training a dog. The Animal Welfare Act of 2006 is in place to safeguard the health and well-being of the dog, and make sure that we have a suitable environment for him to live in and also to train in. We need to ensure that they have an appropriate diet, which in training terms means that you're not overfeeding the dog, because obviously if you're giving lots and lots of cheese rewards, then you may need to adjust the dog's daily rations. You need to make sure that the dog is able to exhibit normal behaviour and that we protect them from pain, injury and disease. Unfortunately, there's currently no formal regulation for trainers and behaviourists in the UK, so it's really important for us all to develop our own code of practice, which in my mind is to be fair, kind and effective, and to always act with empathy, sincerity and respect. There's lots of different ways that you can improve the relationship and bond with your dog. You can play lots of different games. Out in the field you can play chase, preferably with the dog chasing you rather than you chasing the dog. Alfie really enjoys a good game with his Tuggy when he's awake. What's this, Alf? Oh, good boy, what's that? No, there's too many things out of the window this morning, so he's not going to play with me. You can play find-it games in and around the house on wet days. That's a really good game to play. Any form of retrieve is great, and hide and seek. But you don't want to hide too far away from your dog and make it too difficult for him to find you, because he may get worried or upset. Grooming is a really good way of improving the bond as well, and it also gives you the opportunity of giving your dog a health check, make sure there's no bumps or scrapes. Alfie really enjoys massage, this is his special room for massage, so usually when he's on here he's very, very relaxed. It's a really nice way to get in a really close contact with your dog. You can also use T-touch, which is a very specific method of awakening the dog to his body. There's also an awful lot of organised sports available to you. You can see Alfie's nice and relaxed, and he's gone. So you can take part in agility or canicross if you've got a really high activity dog, or if you're wanting your dog to really focus and use his brain, rally and heel work to music is a great way to do this. There's also quite a new sport emerging, which is tri-ball, which is great for herding dogs like Alfie. And lastly, you need to let the dog just be a dog. Let him run in the field and get dirty, let him play and socialise with other dogs, and most importantly, let the dog chill out and you can have a nice relaxing time with him on the sofa.